the reality is, like when I've talked to, I want to say kids, but I'm not that much older than college kids. But when I talk to kids coming to computer science,
well, you're almost twice as old as them. So
actually, that's true. Actually,
Butterscotch
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 384 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, and I'm the webs programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm the artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is October 6th, 2020. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be curses, swears, and profanes in this show. So I hope you like that kind of stuff because it's coming. And if you're a child, we're supposed to say it. You're not supposed to listen, but we know you're going to do that.
That's good.
Yeah.
Also, across 384 episodes where we mention profanity, we have to at some point talked about what fanity is by itself. But I have no recollection of this, and I suddenly became curious.
I think we actually have. I think we definitely have. Are you profanity? Yeah. What's the...
Yeah, because what's the fanity?
Fanes are just words, and profanes are those are the high degree, more professional words.
That's what it is. Yeah.
That
there you go.
That really they pack the most punch, and they're the most versatile.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Got it.
you're not supposed to use them because it's just intimidating to people because your words are too good, and it's kind of like showing off. You know, It's like you don't want to always be the best dressed person everywhere you go because it makes everybody else feel like they now have to dress up. You know, it's like that, but with words.
Totally.
We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thanks everybody for the recurring donations to help us keep our pods insulated, keep them toasty.
Sure. I don't know.
You got to get those. You got to get those
Insulator,
koozies for your mic to keep them warm. Is that what that is? Adam's got one.
Yeah, I think that's what that's for. That was my understanding. Because it gets cold up here in the winter, so you got to keep its little naked head nice and
Put a baby head on it.
Yeah.
Now, I saw in the footage of Hurricane Ian that one of the reporters was putting a condom on her microphone to keep it dry, which is actually pretty brilliant because, you know, the sound can still go through, no problem. It's just a thin, latex layer. But
Also readily available anywhere you gotta go, but a Ziploc bag feels like it might be an easier.
It's probably too thick.
a microphone, is perfect shape to put a condom on.
You're not wrong.
Yeah.
You're not wrong.
And you probably need that, like a thin stretch membrane.
And it's not going to crinkle like a
That's true.
Ziploc bag.
Well, it also needs to vibrate, so it actually carries the vibration of the speech through, So,
Brilliant.
So,
yeah.
so apparently she footage of her like in this hurricane with this like condom microphone went around the internet. People were like, this is crazy. And then she did like a follow-up segment where she was talking about that. Yes, that is indeed what's on my microphone, but it works great. So
Yeah, probably does.
But you don't want the lubricated ones because then, you're in a hurricane. There's a lot of wind. That microphone will just going to zip right out of your hand and it's gone because it's 150 mile per hour winds and it's over. So ideally, non-lubricated, ribbed.
Yeah, ribbed so you can
microphone cover. Anyways, so for today's episode, we're just going to go right into questions because pretty sure we didn't do any last time.
Yeah.
Though we aren't 100% sure because we're having some trouble with our brains and time. And then we looked at the first question for this week and we were like,
did we do questions?
Did we answer that last week? We're pretty sure we didn't.
Yeah.
But
and there's just no way to know. There's literally no way to check.
There's no way
so we're just we're going all in here. We're just gonna see what happens. Okay. So these questions come from our listeners over at podcast.bscotch.net, where people can also upvote questions and push things to the top. So we're just gonna go down the list. So highest upvoted question comes from FlyhoppieAxerompa, who says, Seth, you once referred to LevelHead as your baby and said that if the business could have supported it, you would have worked on LevelHead indefinitely. Do any of you bros ever feel the urge to just make more LevelHead content? I mean, yeah, always, because it is fun.
It already exists, and people are playing it. So
it's always way more gratifying to add stuff to a game that people are already enjoying.
The audience is already there.
Working in a dev cave it gets very tiring after a while because I feel like you lose all sense of reference for like what's good and what's not because you don't have an audience who's constantly reacting to it. So it's very fun to work on that stuff. I think the problem is, we've had this in the past with other games we've worked on, where there's a problem where if at some point the business case for it just doesn't make any sense at all, necessarily to continue putting more time into it, which happened with, some of our free to play games, stuff like that at some point. But it's still the easiest thing for you to do, and very gratifying because there are people playing it. You have this really kind of bizarre, challenging mental state you have to walk, right? Because it's like, technically it's enjoyable, but
and it feels safe, right? Because like you've got an audience, you've got a product, it's cheap. It's one of the cheapest things to do is to add content to a game that now already has is already fleshed out,
and you've got people asking you for it, so like you also want to feel like you're delivering stuff that people want.
Yeah, and of course it's far more fraught to take several years to come up with a whole new thing, work on it for a long time with nobody seeing it,
and then launch it into an uncertain market.
Yeah, in a market that's different than it was when you started because it's been years, right? I mean, everything about making a new thing is just so much more emotionally challenging and financially, I would say financially risky because if you make stuff for a game that's already been out and you're not coming up with ways to monetize the new stuff that you're adding, then it's not financially risky. It's just guaranteed that you're just going to lose money, which is not a risk per se.
Because the risk
it's
depends
guaranteed.
on the context, So because if you take, I think a good example actually is Terraria, because they just launched an update last week.
Yeah.
So Terraria's, it's been 15 years since it came out,
it's the hills.
or something like that. I don't know. It's really old. Maybe not that old, but at least 10 years. And there have been various points along its journey where they were like, that's it. That's the last update. We're going to go work on something else. And for a while they were working on Terraria 2, right? And then that kind of just disappeared, right? And then they had this Journey's End update, which is the last one I remembered, and I hadn't paid attention since. So it was like a year or two ago.
They were like, it's done now.
Yeah, which my understanding was, it was like literally the end, that they were done now.
It seemed like a wrap up.
Yeah, and then they just released this new huge update last week, right? And the whole time they're doing this, like the game is still the same price I think it was like 10. It's like $10, right? It's on sale all the time. It's cheap on mobile. It's on everything, right? And so like every time they release an update, it's just to their existing users, really. But they have so many new users always constantly coming in because the game is so popular, and they just have infinite money. And
they've made like well over $250 million.
They made a lot.
So it's like at that point
they have 40 million sales.
Yeah,
is what they said in their last update, right? So that's a lot. That is a lot. And so,
and when you made that many sales, like Steam or wherever your game is, like they're going to keep showing it to people. You know?
It's a super successful game.
And also there's like algorithmic things. So, if you patch your game, players come back. If you've got 40 million players, a lot of them come back. That pushes your game up the charts and more people see it, right? And so there are ways to generate additional sales off of an already extremely successful game. Yeah.
But it only works if you aren't trying for the growth model, which is hard to avoid under our capitalist structures, right? But especially if you have business partners and stuff like in companies, because everyone's always pushing towards growth. Because what most companies would do with a windfall, like a startup style, right, is they'd start hiring up, they'd start scaling up, right? And so as all their costs go up, the runway gets short, and then all of a sudden it is a risk to make the next thing, or it is a risk to continue working on it, however it balances out, right? But in the case like the Terraria team, if you stay just how you were, basically, then there's no risk to continue along that path, whether you're making a new thing or not. You can just get to kind of make any decision you want to because they all have the same outcome as far as it matters.
Yeah, with their, if they've got like 10 people on their team, they could pay each person $1 million a year, and that could sustain them until they all retire. It would be fine. They probably aren't, because that's not really how things go, how things happen normally. But yeah, I mean, because there is that level of success where it's not. It would be hard to measure how much additional revenue is generated by them releasing these patches, right? And whether that's like cost effective compared to what else they could do. But you're right. There's a certain point where the numbers are so big that who gives a shit? Just do whatever, Yeah,
I think there's also a tendency, and I know I had this definitely early on, which was like, I think there's a want to not necessarily be a studio that's defined by just a title or like a franchise. There's something that feels, I think initially when you start out, feels like that would be, somehow
Limiting.
Yeah, somehow
Sellout.
Yeah, or a sell, yeah, where you're like kind of mining the same vein, over and over.
Creatively bankrupt.
Yeah. But I think as we've gotten further into it, I think my realization has been that like most creatives never even get to have one thing that people give a shit about. So if you have one and you enjoy it and it works great, and you can see ways of, basically evolving it over time. I think like God of War, I think it's like my favorite one to kind of look at from a overall trajectory standpoint, because it's like, the base like spirit of the thing is the same as it has always been. But as far as like an evolutionary thing, you look at that, it's like, it's not just the same, it's not the same game, 5 times or how many times it is now. It's sort of like the next skilled up variant of the game based on the team's new technical skills and like a slightly new direction for it. And it's sort of a constantly evolving thing. And so I think if you land in a space like that's great. And it actually makes a lot of things simpler on the business side and everything else. And so I get it. I think when we started out, it's like, I didn't want to ever make a sequel, to anything, to be honest. But as we've gotten,
in retrospect, it is such a strange stance to take, because if you think about
It's weird,
the things that you enjoy, like you read a great book and you're thinking like, is there another one? Is there more? Is there a fall? Is this a series? Oh man, I hope this is a series, right? Or if I think about some of my favorite games, they're these long-standing franchises. Even like Rocket League was a follow-up to supersonic acrobatic rocket-powered battle cars or whatever, right? It's pretty rare to have something that gets made, is incredibly successful, and then it's over. Right? There's no follow up, no franchise, no sequel, no anything. And what I think is cool about what we've kind of learned with working on Crashlands 2 is that you actually get to spend a lot of time exploring as opposed to like reinventing and re-solving already solved problems, and so like when it comes to Crashlands 2, compared to the original Crashlands, in the original game, we had to think about like the concept of build mode, where you could like enter into this mode to like build your base, right? And we had to spend so much time just figuring out like, what does that mean and how do we convey it and all of that stuff.
And what is the laundry list of all the things we have to consider the impact on with each design choice we make with respect to build mode, right? The door problem that we, spent so much time thinking through it for initial design and then actually building that and then discovering, oh, we didn't think about this thing. Now we have to add, right? So we already did all this iteration on even because we went down a different path this time, same vibe, right? But different mechanisms, right? But we got to start having already with a whole bunch of now sort of known knowns, right? And knowing we also have fewer unknowns because we just kind of explored that space already. So we can now just iterate on it in a new context and kind of have some expectations about what that will mean.
I think in particular, you could push further, on things that you have to just barely get them to a point of being able to get it all working and stuff, oftentimes in original context. And then you get to start with that as the baseline. Like, okay, we know how this can work because we have so much good reference material from the original. So what's the next stuff that we could not do at the time? We couldn't even dream of doing at the time because like it just wasn't an option. I think that's where it gets exciting to me as far as continued work on a particular product, not necessarily even going into a sequel territory, but even additional content or DLCs and stuff like that. There's always stuff to explore. And, LevelHead is the most modular thing we built by far in terms of being able to deliver stuff, but which is why it's so exciting to think about working on it. It's a highly generative, it's like adding a letter to the language, it's like, it's not just like an isolated thing that does only one little bit. It spawns like a ton of new experiences and stuff for players. And
of course, there's also like new traps that you can set for yourself. Like one of the things that we're learning with Crashlands 2 compared to the original is the original had a pretty kind of monolithic progression concept, right? Where like you had a tier of content that was basically represented by a workstation. So you build your crafting station, and it would have a batch of recipes in it, and those would be the recipes that kind of represented what you needed to craft to power yourself up for the next tier of content, right?
And they matched with the sort of geography that you had moved into and the creatures that were present and their difficulty level, that kind of stuff. So it all was just kind of neatly.
And we also just like hard gated stuff for the most part, right? We're like if you didn't have a saw, that was the saw for chopping squee plants, then you would click on them and you just get a message that's like, your saw isn't good enough to chop that.
You literally couldn't get. There was no way for you to get them.
Yeah. And so it's, it's very much kind of like on rails. And as we added content to the game, those questions were just resolved, right? Whenever we were going to add a new tier of content for the next like phase of a zone, we already knew what we needed, right? We needed the armor, we needed the weapons, we needed a tool, we needed a thing to harvest with the tool, all of that. And so it became a very kind of like formulaic kind of progression, right? And still fun and still interesting. But from a design standpoint, it was very simple for us to add stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But what we missed though was this like deep complexity and lateral progression, right? Because you kept kind of moving upward, and there wasn't a lot of flexibility in like exploring out to the sides, like choosing your own path and like going and doing weird stuff, because it always felt like you were doing that instead of moving up. Right. And so like psychologically, there wasn't a big reason for us to go and add those things, because players would be more likely to just progress through the core of the progression. Right. So in Crashlands 2, there's a lot more of these like complex relationships between lateral paths, which is really cool. But from a design perspective, it's very different. Yeah. And so we're having to spend a lot of time developing tools for ourselves to be able to understand and visualize how these things connect together. And our tools are still falling short of that. Like, we have some really cool stuff that we've made, but it's still pretty hard for us to kind of get a full picture of exactly how everything fits together, because things can fit together in so many intricate and interesting ways. And so that's kind of like the new trap that we've laid for ourselves in Crashlands 2. I think it's, I think it makes for a much more robust and interesting kind of gameplay experience, but it is a whole new way of designing, right?
Yeah. It's also about choosing your problems, right? Because in the original, any new content we added naturally would be behind some part of the progression gate, which meant that players would either be already beyond it because they'd progressed past, or they wouldn't be able to access it, which is always annoying. And you're going to have that to a degree, of course, with any content you make. But in a game that's very, very progression oriented in a straight and narrow sort of path, it's actually very, very complicated to add new content to it in a way that is enjoyable for someone along like the whole sort of tier of start to end. Versus part of the idea with the more broad and lateral design of Crashlands 2 is that you can basically actually allows us to continue working on the game in a easier capacity, in a post-launch world where it's like, oh yeah, we can add a whole bunch of stuff, and it'll be interesting for people to get, hopefully more interesting for people to get kind of across the board, as opposed to only at certain moments in their playthrough. So
yep, yeah, and it's much more open. It's a lot less about like having like, because even in the original game, we had the quest log where we had like the main story line that was kind of highlighted in your quest log. So that you always knew, and this is something that you'll see if you look at people talking to each other about, what do I do? What do I do next in Crashlands? Like, I just did this thing. What do I do next? And people always be like, just go to your quest log and follow the main story. Mm-hmm. Right? There's always one answer to what do I do next.
The only one that matters, basically.
Yeah.
Because of progression.
Yeah. And everything else is cool.
Because there's side quests, and there's just stuff you can just go do. You can go build your base, right? But it all feels like those are just, I don't know. It doesn't feel like those are things you should be doing, So like,
yeah, because they're side quests. They're on the side, Yeah. They're not the main thing, right?
They're too clearly side quests, I guess.
Yeah. And so, we want to get away from, we want things to feel more open and more player directed, where you have lots of things you can do, and all of them lead you down viable and interesting paths, and there are different story threads happening all around the world, and you can kind of like go engage with them, and they're going to be, they're less gated, right? In the sense that like
they're not progression, basically. It's the weird thing, right?
Yeah.
Or at least not in the same sense, right? Because there's still
not the same sense,
yeah. There's still things that you like because things have to happen, in some kind of order, right? Because that's just how causality works, right? And so like that's still there, but it's less of like, okay, you do this, then you do this, then you do this. But it could be, there's like 3 different ways you can end up having putting yourself into a scenario where you can then talk to this person about this thing or whatever, right? Or, you can bypass a whole bunch of stuff altogether. And while that might make things a little difficult for you because you just like skipped a whole bunch of stuff and now you have like only shitty things or something, right? Like you could still try to chip away at something that you stumble into when you probably shouldn't have, right? So it's less of just like an aggressive, you can or can't, and more of there's lots of ways you can choose. You can choose to try, right? And it's not just you try and you can't, or you try and you can, but it's you try and there's a huge range of outcomes of like your ability to actually do the thing that you're trying to do.
Yep. Yeah. And so, it's been pretty fun kind of working on this sequel thing, man. Like, as much as we would love to just kind of, honestly, if you go all the way back, like it would have been great if we could have just kept adding stuff to Quadrupus Rampage,
Yeah.
Like, because that is also that is also a pretty modular game,
It still has a lot of people playing it.
It does, yeah.
Like a lot.
It does, yeah. It's still the case that sometimes it's like when I'm playing WoW with my guild mates, I don't really talk a lot about, what I do. And usually when I first meet people, I just tell them like, oh yeah, I'm a programmer, I'm a software engineer, right?
Yeah, I work in tech.
Yeah. And then like at some point, sometimes they do find out what I do. And every now and then somebody will be like, oh, what games have you made? And I'll be like, oh, well, the couple that like have probably gotten the most traction would be like, Crashlands, Quadrupus Rampage. And every now and then somebody would be like, oh, Quadrupus Rampage. And actually, because they both like had enough traction that people will know about them, which is pretty cool. And it would have been great if we could have just keep working on them. But nope, got to move on at some point. So, our next question comes from Beekie Boppaboop, who says, I'm looking at going to college, and I'm wondering what your opinions are on computer science degrees and game design degrees. Are they worth it? Is it better to do the former because it creates a better sea of job opportunities, computer science? Is it better to do the latter if that's what I'm passionate about? Would you even recommend either of those as a career, knowing what you know?
This is very tricky. Context is very...
Yeah, the first... The only real answer here, but then we can get into like some, off the cuff things. But the only real answer is it completely depends on the programs themselves. As in like, there's actually not such a thing as a computer science degree or a game design degree, right?
As a standardized concept.
There is like, sure, you end up with a piece of paper at the end that has some combination of words like that on it, right? But the thing you're actually there for is to learn about and how to understand and do something, right? And any given institution is going to have a different set of people managing those departments and those courses and those programs. So I think the thing that's really risky about game related stuff as programs in college is that, remember, colleges are businesses, right? And they are trying to sell you something, right? They're competing with each other. So as soon as game development started to become a much more just widespread, but also possible thing with the rise of all these like engines that let you get in with a much lower hurdle, and with the rise of all these places where you can just publish your games to, right? Without all the gatekeepers and stuff. So with that came this huge sea of people who wanted to make games. And so colleges started to make programs, right? But what they tended to do was just like grab somebody from their computer science department who was like maybe into it a little bit, but had never made games, but was like, could program. And they were like, hey, build our game design program, right? And there are a few programs out there that are actually like they've tried to poach people from
some industry people, basically.
Yeah, AAA, like industry people, right? But the problem is that like academia pays so terribly, and that just keeps getting worse. And tech pays so well that there are so few people who have like found success
to make the jump, basically.
And in the games industry who are actually in academia currently, because it also hasn't been long enough to have like a huge sea of like retired people or whatever, right? So the end result has been, when I have talked to people who have completed game development and game design programs, for the most part, when they talked about like what they learned and what they did, it was just woefully insufficient to set them up meaningfully. And I'm not even talking about just like being able to get a job, because there's like kind of two problems here, right? Because a degree is also that you end up with, that's also now a business thing where you're trying to sell yourself and your degree to an employer, right? Mm-hmm. And that's also disconnected from reality in the same way that a program is from, like a degree name is from the actual program itself. And so there's kind of two separate questions here, right? One is like getting a job, and the other one is feeling like you're actually prepared to do what you're trying to do, right? Mm-hmm. And so remember that those are literally disconnected. There's just no connection there. And so you have to pay really close attention to what it is you're trying to do and how much more important it is to you to either like actually know how to do that thing versus get a job doing that thing. Because, you know, you can learn stuff on the job and you can figure stuff out, right? And pick that path accordingly. So just from a strategic perspective, you got to know what you're trying to do. And it really, really, really depends on your institution. Like as a good example, when I went to college, I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer, right? That was my initial
I remember that.
dream, right? Yeah. And my top two choices were huge engineering schools. They were MIT and Caltech, right? And I didn't get into them, but I got into my third choice, which was University of Chicago. So University of Chicago, it's like the joke is that it's all theoretical, nothing is applied. That's the whole. It's about how to think, not how to do, right? That's the whole joke, right? Which turned out was perfect for me, and I loved it. But all of a sudden, I got to college and they didn't have like an engineering program, right? They didn't have the things that I thought I needed to set myself up. And so I was just like, okay, well, now that I'm here though, what can I do in this context that will get me the most prepared to do something, right? And so I just kind of did like a general purpose science stuff, right? And then ended up choosing biology specifically because I was just into it, but like really kind of branching out and just like doing lots of weird math and doing lots of just weird stuff, right? Because my goal is to say, I just want to learn how to think about lots of stuff so that I don't have to come in being like just counting on my degree program, like to see me through the next part. And so it's really hard to separate like the dream of, oh, I want to be an X, right? From the practical reality of college not actually providing that for anybody. Or it's not actually
it's not a super standard pathway ever, basically, I think, especially into games.
Especially in games.
Yeah. So my context-free version of this in terms of advice.
Yeah.
Which is
without knowing the programs available to you.
Yeah. If I don't know what program I'm going to, don't know what college it is, also don't even know exactly what you're trying to do. But in general, my hot take, here's my hot take on game design degrees. I think that if you were to study a particular skill-based job in the industry, so it's like programming or art, or basically some of the hard points of where the rubber has to meet the road in terms of the things that you're designing have to become a thing that can go into the game, right?
Yep.
I think if you were to choose to study one of those things as kind of a foremost thing, and then consider your other time spent on basically expansive, looking around at how just things work in general. So taking a more broad array of classes in just stuff.
Yeah, that's the main thing. Do a true liberal arts degree as it was like meant to be, right? And that's like, yeah, I truly like deep dove into the sciences, right? But I did a broad array of that stuff. Like the end result was I didn't come out as a biologist. I came out as a statistics, deep biology, physics. Like I came out with like the ultimate of nerds, right? And was able to just plow through something. But I read tons of stuff about everything else too while I was there, right? So it was like psychology, like just anything. And all three of us did really wide amounts of learning, whether self-directed or through taking lots of courses or both, right? And
but none of it was computer science. None of it was art, and none of it was game design.
So, but this is what I'm kind of getting at, which is like, I think taking that really broad view of just stuff you're interested in. And then the best degree that I could recommend for games is to just do game jams. I'm not even kidding. Like Seth and I, when we taught our class at Wash U, we basically realized that if our students just did a weekend game jam, like a 48-hour one, say one or in like at maximum in like pairs, you're getting a semester's worth of schooling in that 48 hours. And it sounds weird because like you're like, oh, but it's self-directed and like blah. And yes, but also
but it's learning by doing.
It's learning by doing. And it's just I can't even quite describe how how much more impactful if you were to do like literally a game jam every semester with some hard skill that you're learning in the background, so whether it's programming, art, whatever. And then while you're taking some classes in just other random cool stuff that you're interested in, you'd come out, and to Adam's point, you'd come out a very unique candidate for any given job. And that's a much easier position to actually be in at the end of the day, I think, than being only a candidate of like game design or comp sci or whatever else. Because no one actually, I don't want to say no one cares, but like the degree gets you, it's like the threshold pass, but only vaguely in the industry. Like, if
it depends on how much is valued, right? Because I think the thing about a computer science degree, it's like I said, this is all disconnected from reality, right? So a computer science degree, especially from a prestigious institution, just makes it easy to get a job, independent of what, if anything, you know about programming, right?
Yes.
Because a computer science degree is assumed to be a stand-in, a proxy for your ability to basically do computer stuff, which then, for some reason, only becomes focusing on programming, because that's the useful thing to do that most people have access to when they come out with those, right?
It's the profitable thing to do.
It's the profitable thing to do. Yeah, and that's where the job market is that huge group. The reality is, like when I've talked to, I want to say kids, but I'm not that much older than college kids. But, when I talk to kids coming to computer science,
Well, you're almost twice as old as them. So
actually, that's true. Actually, they are kids. So when I talk to kids coming out of computer science programs, the thing that tends to almost be universally true is they actually don't learn like the practical tools for how to build software, and especially not with a team, right? No. But you walk away though with this computer science degree that out in the world, out in the job market, people just use those proxies, right? And so that can work. When it comes to something like game design or game development, those are too young of academic programs for institutions that you're trying to go into to like just look at that and be like, oh, this person must like actually be good at this.
Must know their shit. Yeah.
Yeah. And especially because like, and again, because like the institution you go to, it itself is a standard for a proxy for how good your program is and so on and so forth, right? But also individual programs, if they are well established and like the people in there are well known, right? Also can create a name for themselves where somebody sees like, oh, you went to this program with that school and then had that professor as your thesis advisor. Like if they know all of that, then like the proxy signal keeps getting stronger and stronger, right? But similarly, it gets weaker and weaker the less they know and the less standardized some kind of a program is. So I think the risk of like just literally doing game design or game development is that out in the market, the job market, nobody will actually know what to do with that as a proxy. And so it doesn't really work very well as like.
Yeah. And then I think experientially in the actual program itself, I do think that again, hot take, very few programs are actually giving you what I think you're probably wanting, right? Which is to be able to do those things really effectively. Typically, they
either make your own games and run your own business or go out in the industry as an employee.
Yeah, no programs can do that.
No, they can't. That's not what they're for.
Yeah. My take on this is you get out what you put in. And if you're getting a game design degree, you're not going to be putting in the things that game design actually requires, because game design is all about it's about integrating a huge number of disciplines, right? So you need to understand like narrative structures, you need to understand psychology, and even things like economic growth models and like how things like how to take real things and turn them into simplified models, which is like economics, right?
You also know about storytelling. You need to know about production.
There's storytelling, music, writing, cinematography. Like these are all the things that come together to make a game. Game design is just the act of putting them together, right? But if you don't have a baseline of experience and knowledge in those different domains and what you have as a game design degree, then you're not going to be able to communicate effectively your ideas, and you're not necessarily going to have the foundational knowledge to pull from to integrate your ideas into a functional game experience, right?
It doesn't even need to be an expert in all of those things, right? But
you got to know some stuff.
Yeah, the beauty of a liberal arts college degree is that you have access, in theory, right, to people and the programs they've put together, the learning programs put together, to learn a wide array of interesting stuff, right?
You remember that creature from Adventure Time who's trying to jump on Finn and misses at one point, and then he says, "I have approximate knowledge of many things."
Yeah, that's what you want to be.
That's I think if you want to make video games like for real, I think that's a really useful way to think about it. And that doesn't mean that like a degree program is bad. I think the really underlying point that all of us are saying is that if that's the thing you are solely relying on, you will be left empty-handed because what it actually requires is a lot of supplemental knowledge from other fields. And so sometimes it may be just easier to focus on those other fields and do high impact versions of game design learning, which is game jams and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing that teaches you how to make games is making games.
Yep.
That's in my mind, that's the only thing that you can use to learn how to make games. Kind of like if you want to become a great artist, can you do that by taking a course on art and taking some tests and like reading a bunch about art? No, you got to put the pen to the paper, right? And you have to do that a shitload for a long time. And what it is that you're then integrating into that is your understanding of the world around you and color theory, and like you're learning about perspective and all these other things.
It's your unique take, right? Which is like, you don't want your only uniqueness, quote unquote, your only take to be sort of the stamp of how to put paint on a canvas, right? It's like you got to brew something interesting in yourself so that when you go to express it through design or whatever else, that it is something that could have only been made by you, given that context. And I think then you start hitting on some really fun magical territory.
Yeah. And I will take a bolder stance here, and I'll say that in many cases, a game design degree is worse than nothing because it's not free.
Yeah.
Yes.
You may have to go into debt.
You will
to get
have to go
a game design degree, and I think that your prospects of getting a job with a game design degree don't really mean anything unless you have a portfolio of games that you have made and worked on, which you can do without a game design degree, right? So at that point, the game design degree doesn't really need to be there because you've already proven it with your portfolio. So given that like college, well, I guess it depends where you live, right? If you're in the U.S., college has a cost, a financial cost.
A life debt.
And in many cases, it's a long-term debt, and you do need to think about possible earning potential, and like what happens if because game dev careers can be pretty fraught with overwork and underpay and high demand for jobs that are hard to get, right? And so having a degree in something that is more broadly applicable allows you to kind of weather those storms, right? So that you can, if you need to, go somewhere, make good money doing something, as a backup plan, basically, right? Because like I have a degree in economics and finance, right? Which was my plan B, right? And in the course of getting that degree, I learned tons and tons of stuff about modeling and business, and when I say model, I mean like financial modeling. modeling real world scenarios. Yeah, modeling real world scenarios mathematically and through formulas, which turns out to be incredibly useful in games, right? And all of that knowledge has come in handy as we make our games, and I use it every day as we make our games. But at the same time, that knowledge is also a fallback. If everything hits the fan, I can work in a variety of other fields and be secure and safe. Right. And so you do need to think about the cost of what it is that you're doing, the cost of acquiring that degree, the financial cost, because it's real, You
don't know it's being real until, I think oftentimes until in post, it's like after college is where that reality can sink in real hard for people.
Yeah. And you can't always bank on just randomly a chunk of your debt being forgiven. I don't know how many more times that's going to happen, but
yeah. Well, I think this is what it took me a long time to understand. Basically, after I was done with a very large amount of schooling, right? Which is, it always felt like what school's purpose was, and like a degree program's purpose was and stuff, was to basically teach you like the stuff you're supposed to know, quote unquote, right?
The actual
about
skills.
Something, right? But the reality is that no such thing exists, right? There's no such set of things that you're supposed to know for any given thing. And as a consequence, if you go to any degree program across the whole world, right? Any two programs that claim to be the same thing, they're both computer science, right? Sure, there's going to be some overlaps, right? Because there's going to be commonality, right? But the thing that makes like one program great and actually prepare you for something and one terrible and not is who's teaching what, right? It's the whole fucking thing. And if the people there are not doing a good job of teaching, or if they're teaching you stuff that just doesn't matter, if they're teaching you stuff in a way that you can't really adapt to the reality of post-education. Because like once you get out of education, you're not going to be like using the same approaches that you used in college, right? Like
You actually can't.
you can't. That's not actually what you're supposed to be trying to do is learning how to adapt. You're not trying to learn about how stuff is, right? Because how stuff is a moving target. And even if it wasn't, it's different in any two places. You're trying to just to learn enough ways of thinking about the world via different sort of angles on it, that when you then go out to try to accomplish things and the world is chaos, then you could try to synthesize that chaos using all of these tools you now have to actually go do stuff, right? And I think because the mistake that I think we all go through because we're all taught the same sort of idea. It's like go to school, then you go to college, you pick a degree program so you can make money, and then whatever, right? And it just like that is the path, but the reality of it is just practically speaking much different than that because it's actually just kind of random chance, right? Like which school you get into is actually like which school you choose to go to if you're just going to go to college, if that's just part of the plan, right? Then once you get to that school, your decision about what like major to take should be based on what the school does best, right? Because that's actually what's going to set you up, right?
Adapt a bit, yeah.
Yeah, you actually have to adapt, but that doesn't mean like, oh, well, this school's good at business and that's it. So now I have to be a business person, right? No, it means like maybe that's then because they'll do a bunch of stuff, right? But like you just choose one of the things that they're actually really good at, they have great programs in, but then try to diversify, right? Try to get into their stuff, right? And that's actually what sets you up to be able to be adaptable, but also to come out with something that is likely to provide the most like fallback value no matter what happens. Because if people can look at that and they're like, oh yeah, your school is known for X, you did X, right? Then now you can go out on the job market, right? But if you also walked away being truly adaptable because you tried lots of stuff and you just adapted to your circumstances instead of trying to force it into what you wanted, right? Then that'll give you the most opportunity just to go control your own life too.
It is kind of wild how much random chance there is because I'm thinking about like, why did I go into economics? Because like, what the I can't even. That was actually we had one economics class in high school and I hated it. It was my worst one, right? Actually, similarly, I took a comp sci course my first semester of college and I got a terrible grade in that. And I hated that too, right? And so like later in college, I ended up majoring in economics. And then later in life, I ended up being a programmer, right? And so like the randomness is so external because it's all about the intensity and passion and excitement of the professors that you end up having. And then also kind of like these just random one-off events, right? Like maybe you were trying to get into one class, but it was full. So you instead, sign up for this other course because you needed a credit, right? And then the professor in that course that you didn't even want to take and something that you thought you didn't care about is just so pumped about like, I don't know,
whatever
molecular bonds.
This is how I ended up doing biology with a focus in genetics was because in my third year of college, I've been doing like a broad array of stuff. I mean, mostly science stuff, but still like all over the place, My third year of college, though, I had a professor in a genetics class, a collection of professors actually, who were like top of their field researchers who told us at the very beginning, they're like, everything you see in this textbook is wrong, but it's the most recent textbook we have because it came out a year or two ago, right? But it's all wrong because like, there's no such thing as a textbook. And then like, it was the first time I'd been confronted with that idea of like, oh, like you actually, the whole point is to live on the edge of where you just don't know anything, right? That's actually what the goal of like a science career is, right? And they approached that class from that sort of an angle where it was all focused on how do we know what we think we know? And actually, look, it turns out it's all just a house of cards, right? And like it was taught in such an interesting, compelling way, and my professors were so interesting that I just got hooked. And then all of a sudden that set me on the path. But now what am I doing?
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. Right? You're doing the same thing though, right? Because
exactly. Adapting and learning and becoming adaptable, right?
Yeah, because what you're really trying to get out of anything is a great toolkit for how to solve problems and think critically, right?
Yeah.
And you can do that with a chemistry degree, a business degree, engineering, psychology, whatever. And the difference at the end of the day is really just then sort of like the kinds of domains of knowledge that you're touching into. And that like the reservoirs of knowledge that you're building up to then pull from as you're using your critical thinking skills later on, right? So as long as you come out of it with that, then you're in a really good spot. But yeah, you still want to be safe about it, right? And like do something that's going to give you some options. Because as long as you've got that toolkit, then you can kind of navigate through whatever it is.
Well, and I do think the whole like the thing that we were sort of sold, like the messaging we were sold as kids of like, choose your passion and find a way to make that happen or whatever, right? I think that's just the wrong angle, which is not to say you shouldn't go do game dev, right? And like but it's to say that
it also assumes you have a passion. I mean, I did.
Yeah, I
was
didn't.
confused the whole time.
Yeah, me neither.
Basically.
Yeah. But yeah, I was just trying to figure out like, cause what I thought is like there's just real stuff about the world and I got to go figure it out. And then at some point it'll be obvious was like that's like the vibe we're getting.
That's
right?
the message. Yeah.
But the reality is that it doesn't fucking matter what you do as long as you end up enjoying it and can survive doing it. Right. Because everything is interesting. You could pick the most, like, there's all the things that people are like, oh, accounting is so boring. There's like these classic things where everyone's just like, that's the boring shit, right? Or statistics, right? You deep dive into any of that shit, fucking fascinating, right? It's all so interesting, but any given thing is not going to be necessarily your thing, right? But if you've pre-decided what your thing is because you had to have a thing, right? Then you don't actually have the opportunity to just like adapt to the reality of what life actually is, which is just pure chaos driven trajectories, right? Because if I had actually just stayed on my path of like, because at some point in college I was like, all right, I'm gonna be like a molecular biology researcher, right? And or at that time I was a geneticist, right? But when I was visiting grad schools to go like talk to professors, right, I just happened to be standing in line with these two professors and started chatting with them about what they work on, and it was weird, like mathematical modeling of cell biology stuff, and nothing I'd ever thought about my whole life. And it didn't hit my skill sets because at that time I was like teaching myself programming, but I was like a year in and didn't know, anything really. But I was like, well, this sounds cool. And they were describing their team, and it was like, oh yeah, our postdocs, we got like an electrical engineer and a computer scientist and a mathematician is like their lab. And I was like, okay, I didn't know this was a kind of thing that existed, but and I don't know what I would do in this context, but like I should go get in that context, And so then I did. I ended up in that lab and just learned the weirdest collection of shit, right? And it was fucking rad, right? And it was like the fact that I was standing in line, right? And talk to those people is literally the only reason that my life has ended up where it is today, right? And it was because like I didn't come into it being like I need to find the best genetics person because I want to be a geneticist, right? It was because I was like I was ready to adapt to whatever interesting thing presented itself, right? And I think that is the thing that ideally you try to get out of just life in general, but especially like to me, the whole purpose of a liberal arts education is supposed to be that. It's supposed to be learn a broad array of stuff from a perspective of how to think about that stuff, not how because like high school, like all of your schooling up until college is basically a whole bunch of just fucking wrong claims about how the world is, right? They just say, here's how the world is. They tell you a whole bunch of stuff and it's all wrong, right? And then in college, you're supposed to then be taught, here's how to think about all of the things so that you understand why they're all wrong, like why these simple answers are just not correct and like how to approach problems, right, in a broad way. But because everything becomes focused on like the degree program and getting a job afterwards, right, then it all ends up getting funneled again through like, here's how it is, right? And you'll be the most able to adapt to the world around you that actually exists if you truly do the broad thing and focus on how to think about it, not the specifics of what you're actually doing in the moment.
So I guess to pull it all together, I guess our recommendation would be get as diverse a knowledge base as you can, right? And use that college opportunity to try to develop a great toolkit of critical thinking and problem solving while also still focusing on a foundational knowledge and at least something that is like useful and, more specific. But don't do that at the exclusion of everything else. Like don't close yourself off. And
more accurately, it's not about it being useful. It's about other people out in the world who are going to provide economic opportunities to you finding it useful. Right? Yeah,
exactly.
That's actually,
Because everything is, like Adam said, everything is interesting and useful, but not everything is treated the same in the marketplace, right?
And in fact, things
that's a reality.
Has really high value. Like just aren't, like the fact is like most of finance stuff, its value is only created because people decided it's valuable, right? It doesn't actually do anything useful, but that's the most valuable thing you can get. So it's not about utility. It's not about real utility, because none of this is real. This is all imaginary shit, right? That we're all as people just making up together. So it's about like,
we learned a lot about what an essential job is over the past couple of years. And almost none of those essential jobs require a college degree, as it turns out, to actually keep the world running. So, I don't know. It's pretty wild out there, but at the very least, just like don't wait. If you want to make games, and don't wait around for a degree program to hand one to you,
or until you're ready, because you just aren't.
Yeah.
Well, and if you do learn something specific, and I think actually the best thing I took away from my own academic path was that if there's ever anything I want to learn, I literally can just go learn it. There's just stuff out there, and especially like these days with the quality of shit you can find on like YouTube, like for anything you want to know, there's some fucking genius person who's like dedicated hundreds of hours of their life to like constructing an amazing learning experience. They're just giving it to you on YouTube, right? For anything. So if there's ever anything you want to learn, like, because I think that's the key thing is just the curiosity. It's just being like, there isn't a way the world is. There's just a whole bunch of questions. And then the interesting stuff is when you're on those edges where there aren't any real answers. There's just people doing their best and like exploring that space. Like when you learn how to do that. And yeah, honestly, I think a college degree is a marketing gimmick that we all have to go through to get jobs, But they do, like a good institution, though, part of it does actually expose you to really smart people, lots of them, right? Lots of really smart people who also are your classmates, right? You'll learn a lot from them too, and maybe even more, right? It's basically trying to identify from what things you can actually learn stuff. And again, it doesn't matter what it is. It matters how it's being presented and who's doing it and how into it they are, because all knowledge and all learning is basically transferable, right? It's all just patterns and like how to think kind of stuff. And so if you focus on opportunities that present themselves to you that live in that domain, it's not about the specifics of what it is. It's about how it's being done. That's how you can walk away and just be ready for the chaos of the real world.
That's what you need. Yeah. So I hope that's helpful. There's a lot, but I hope it's helpful. And that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sapa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.